So I'm going to introduce our panelists. Some you'll see in the room with me now, and some you will find in the participant list, and they will come up as they answer some of our questions. First, we have Professor Hanri Mostert, who is the SARChi Chair, the South African Research Chair for Mineral Law in Africa. We also have Dr. Bernard Kenny on my left here, and Richard Kramer across, who are both postdoctoral researchers at the chair. We have Kennedy Shege with us, who is a doctoral researcher at the chair. On our panelist list, you'll see Bongani Sayidini, who is the Chief Operating Officer for the Petroleum Agency of South Africa. We also have Professor Fatima Mandu, a professor at the University of Zambia. We have Rebecca Payne, Chris Adamako Nkaiche, and Robert Kirunda, who are all PhD students at Milia. We have Hannah Massane, Mwaba Mulenga, both master students at Milia. And we have Patrick Lukuza, who is completing an interdisciplinary master's degree at WITS in public affairs, banking and finance law, and economics. We have Rafilwe Ngweku, who is an engineer currently appointed at the senior project engineer and consultant at ETA operations. And last but not least, we have Dalet Ansi, who is an associate at ENS Africa. So to start us off, we're going to have Hanri speak to us about the collaboration that we have currently started on the impacts of COVID-19 in the mining sector. Thanks so much, Hanri, for being here, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Aysha. And I take it that we are on 4 name terms in this conversation. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers, MTM and the Institute for Metals and Metallurgy, for giving us this opportunity. And I would also like to acknowledge our funders, the National Research Foundation, for making it possible, including making this panel possible with the equipment that we have been able to afford. Thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge my team members. Some of them are here in the room with us, some of them are on your screens. And it's a great privilege to be working with such unbelievable individuals. And thank you very much for all your participation and collaboration. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this one particular project that we are working on. It is funded by a rapid grant fund through the National Research Foundation. And it is specifically around COVID-19 in the mining sector. I'm sure by now, all of us know that in our lifetime, very few other phenomena have tested individuals, communities, and businesses, and even governments' resilience as much as COVID-19 has. It has been globally disruptive, spectacularly disastrous to economies and societies, and it's brought our country's economic sustainability under serious threat. The mining sector is one of the major contributing sectors towards the job market and the economic outlook of the country. And it has not been spared from the crisis that is the COVID-19 pandemic. Research into how the mining sector has dealt with diseases in the past show a poor track record, but also a growth mindset. And Richard is going to speak more about that, I'm sure, when you ask him, Aysha. I think what the past has taught us, at least, is that productivity and profitability tend to go hand in hand, and a healthy workforce is more productive than one that is unwell. South Africa has been on its knees already before COVID-19 hit. It's been plagued with what has become known as the evil triplets of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And COVID-19 have made our people ill, but the economic consequences of trying to keep them out of harm's way have made our mining sector infirm to begin with. The 2020 lockdown was a precautionary measure to arrest the rapidly growing infection rates. And this has placed many mining companies in distress. And I'm sure Kennedy Chege will be talking about this later when he is prompted. Even mining companies that were previously financially healthy have been forced to take drastic action to survive, and particularly hard hit were smaller companies. In the wake of business distress and a severely impaired economic outlook, mining companies had to assess their viability and take steps to avoid bankruptcy. Mass retrenchments had been one strategy. It made financial sense to distressed companies, but it did not make socio-economic sense to those targeted for retrenchments. And it has also significantly increased general unemployment in South Africa. The effects were devastating, jeopardized livelihoods of individuals, mining communities susceptible to economic inactivity, regression on social development, ultimately even higher numbers of people below the poverty line. Retrenchments have also given rise to other trends. There has been discernible increase in urban-rural migration. Life is perceived as more affordable outside the cities, and effective municipalities now have to receive the inflow of people, many of whom are living hand to mouth. Undoubtedly, the COVID-19 pandemic is a disruptive event. What is frightening for everybody, but especially people in leadership and management positions, is how little we know for sure. Under such conditions, it is easy to despair. At the SARChi for Mineral Law in Africa, we engage in all kinds of methods of studying the legal frameworks that facilitate resource extraction in Africa. With the rapid COVID-19 grant funding, we wanted to see the potential that hides inside a disruptive event. And being lawyers, most of us, we are interested in the mechanisms residing in the law, using the laws we have to our best advantage under a new reality, and reforming the laws that no longer serve our purposes. Imagining how a disruptive event such as COVID-19 may lead to new horizons, we try to engage the present and the future in a conversation. And the conversation we have here today will identify many of the areas which we should be paying attention to, taking COVID-19 as our disruptive event: health and safety, governance, social, environmental, and economic imperatives. One ongoing theme is how to fashion a just transition to a new extractive age, and that will probably require plans to incentivize reskilling of the workforce. It's a realization that has been a long time coming, but COVID-19 really turned the volume up on this particular aspect. Another issue is around municipal well-being. In this moment of disruption, what is quite frightening is that the systemic challenges experienced at the municipal levels before COVID-19 struck are now exacerbated by it. The infrastructural weaknesses and capacity constraints that were already prevalent in the system and that have caused severe backlog on transformation and sustainable housing programs now augment the challenge. When the mines are not performing well, it has a ripple effect on the municipal economies. And the financial sustainability of many municipalities across South Africa is under siege, to the extent that basic service delivery has become almost impossible. This was already a grave concern and cause for protest before COVID-19 struck, but now the situation is dismal in some places. And to complicate matters, where the economic effects of COVID-19 impoverish communities, robbing them of their livelihoods, they become more dependent on municipalities. And where such communities have been overly dependent on mines, their economic strategies for resilience tend to be limited. Another concern is the exponential rise in homelessness. Housing provision has been one of democratic South Africa's ongoing problems. Already before COVID-19, government was battling to meet the growing demand for housing. Mining companies have to some extent taken over significant responsibilities of housing provision in some mining-dependent communities, but lockdown and physical distancing, coupled with displacement and the release of people from dormitory-type accommodation have, it seems, pushed us into an abyss of rising need and diminishing capacity to perform. To turn the note into something a little bit more hopeful, though, in South Africa, we are facing severe problems. And yet it is a testimony to the strength of spirit of the South African people that we keep doing what we can. Government, the mining sector, and mine communities have already started responding to this new era of challenges. There are short-term responses and longer-term strategies. The COBRA initiative, for instance, and the UIF TERS support are two noteworthy interventions. Stimulus packages and financial support to specific initiatives and even to municipalities have been made available. The real challenge, however, is that there is simply not enough money that we can throw at the problems surfacing from COVID-19 because some of these problems have already existed earlier. The housing issue is a case in point. Take, for instance, the purported revision of the Housing and Living Conditions Standard incorporated into South Africa's mining laws. This will operationalize the imperative upon the mining industry to provide mine employees with a decent, livable environment, with healthcare schemes, Bernard will also talk about, balanced nutrition, water, and other related amenities. It is an imperative expressed by the AMCU judgment of 2020, which requires each mining house to have a code of practice for housing. The short-term codes of practice and the long-term vision of sustainable transformation in housing plans both intend to improve the lives of miners and contribute to long-term sustainable transformation. Mining companies have come to the table despite operating under quite debilitating circumstances, and communities have showed up. So, for instance, there's been mine-initiated work-creating opportunities, as well as support initiatives by mining companies in struggling municipalities for provision of basic services. In an all-hands-on-deck kind of scenario, where all of us must do what we can to keep the metaphorical ship that is our country afloat, one can welcome such initiatives, and certainly public-private partnerships have in the past contributed to addressing or management of other crises, not at least HIV/AIDS, specifically in relation to mining. It will not bode well for the integrity of government, though, if the private sector is expected to fulfill government functions in the long run. So it is crucial for government to claw back these responsibilities and execute its functions in a reliable and transparent manner, also honoring the Batupele principles. Finally, thinking about all of the effects that COVID-19 has already had on the mining sector, and what we need to keep on doing to keep the lights on, what we need to discontinue because it no longer serves us, and what we need to start doing to move from imagining a new future, the conversation we're having today encompasses some of the suggestions the Milia team has been able to put forward. And I'm looking forward to engaging in this conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hanri, for giving that overview and that clear map for us of what the impacts have been. And I think we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the historical consciousness that we kind of need to understand what is going to happen next, almost a little bit of a precursor. So what, in your opinion, Richard, would you see as the main motivator for the mining industry during these health crises? What is the trends that you're seeing in your study?
So in my work, I've looked at the main motivator for the mining companies, and it always seems to be profit. Even when the mining companies seem to be doing good, generally it's the profit motive behind that. So obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, the mining industry has done a lot to appear as if it's acting benevolently towards its employees. But if you go back in history, you'll see really the approach of mining companies to the COVID-19 pandemic fits into a wider history of mining and disease in South Africa. So obviously, we're not seeing anything as bad as, say, the cover-up of smallpox we saw at the Kimberley diamond diggings in the 1880s, or the initial period of neglect towards HIV/AIDS in the 1980s and the 1990s, often the mining industry likes to point out that when it came to HIV/AIDS, it, particularly in the early 2000s, it took a very proactive approach and ensured its employees got ARVs. But it only took this approach once ARVs became affordable and once it was shown that this approach was the more profitable approach rather than leaving HIV/AIDS to fester. So now we get to COVID and we are seeing what seems to be a very positive response by the mining industry. But we must keep in mind that the mining industry is driven primarily by profit, and we mustn't just let our guard down just because it seems like the mining industry is doing good now. The mining industry does not have a good track record over the last century and a half when it comes to disease. So it's important that civil society and relevant stakeholders ensure the mining industry is held accountable and acts transparently going forward.
Thank you so much, Richard. Now, going from this, still maintaining this historical point, I'd like to kind of move from profit-driven to what are the people's impacts. So I'm thinking to rope in Hannah from our panelist list and ask you to just explain a little bit about South Africa's historical reliance on migrant workers and what are the kind of public concerns that you see facing migrant workers specifically. So looking at a specific type of vulnerability in our historical context.
Hi, Aysha, thank you so much. Yeah, so I've been looking at the effect that the pandemic has had on migrant mining workers specifically. I've mostly been looking at cross-border migrant workers, although of course, a lot of our mine workers in South Africa are domestic migrant workers drawn often from the Eastern Cape into the northern reaches of our country. So the migrant labor system is deeply entrenched in South Africa's mining sector. So historically, if we go back to the discovery of gold and diamonds in the 1800s, and then the establishment of the industry into the early 1900s, the areas around the mines typically did not have enough of a sustainable population to feed the voracious appetite for labor. And so the mining sector became reliant on really vast numbers of young men traveling extremely long distances from a far field as Angola, Tanzania, but most importantly, our neighboring countries, Mozambique, Eswatini, Botswana, and Lesotho. And today, about 10% of our mining sector still, of our mining workforce is drawn from these four neighboring countries. And that doesn't even take into account migrant workers from other African countries or the domestic ones. So really, the issues facing migrant workers are a very important part of the mining sector. It's still crucial to that. And what we've seen in this pandemic is a real echo of the issue that Prof. Mostert raised in her introductory statement, where there are specific direct public health concerns that affect migrant workers. But the real vulnerability comes in with the socioeconomic and political fallout of this pandemic. So of course, with the direct health concerns, the first thing is that the migrant labor system does provide an avenue for communicable diseases to spread over vast distances. And then that is compounded by the fact that mining work itself places workers into a very vulnerable position with a virus like SARS-CoV-2 because it attacks the lungs. So occupational health and safety concerns like working in close quarters, the likelihood of developing asthma or silicosis or tuberculosis will then really compound the issue. But as I said, the real vulnerability is with the socioeconomic fallout that comes from this pandemic. So the way in which our migrant labor system has been set up is facially, these workers typically have to support vast networks back in the labor sending areas. So what does that really mean? It means that migrant workers have to send most of their money back home. It means that there's much less of a chance to save and to insulate themselves against socioeconomic shocks. Add to the fact that long COVID is a serious concern and what's the word I'm looking for? Compounded with the diseases that I mentioned earlier. That really all comes together to put migrant workers into a situation where any kind of economic shock could push them over into severe poverty. And on top of that, might be stuck across borders. But the one glimmer of hope in this whole situation is that it seems that mining companies have really shifted in how they're looking at their cross-border employees. They've gone to significant financial and administrative effort to retain and to bring back their employees from places like Mozambique and Botswana and Lesotho. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people. So what this does give us is a real great opportunity to review the situation of migrant workers and to provide better protections that are tailored to their situation.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that perspective. I see that Biolongo Elise Ishiloke has added a comment, and I'll just read it out to everyone. Not only that, migrant workers form an important part of the mining sector or activities. Research in Johannesburg has shown that migrants have contributed positively to the economy of this country. I'm sure you agree with that.
Very much so. And in fact, you'll see that the mining houses have been very vocal on the fact that their migrant workers are not, the idea from the colonial and apartheid project is really broken down, where at that time migrant workers were looked at really as valuable insofar as the cheap labor that they could provide. And that has really shifted during this pandemic. Migrant workers are now acknowledged for being a source of uniquely skilled labor, without which our mining houses, they really can't function without them. And that is why there's been such an effort to bring them back and to retain them.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to hand over to the crux of this issue, which is around health and safety in a big way. So I'd like to ask Bernard here, what is the main kinds of health and safety initiatives that you've seen come through during this pandemic?
Thank you, Aysha. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to our audience or other participants. So what I observed through working on my research, which looks at health and safety in the mining sector, is that while the government made an effort to issue guidelines on what mining companies should do to make sure that the sector is safe for people to work in, I must mention that the government only got to that after a court ruling. So the government was compelled by a court ruling to issue those guidelines, but nonetheless, they did. And mining companies on their side, they took it seriously, and they implemented the guidelines and also established their own safety, COVID safety guidelines to supplement or to comply with what the government guidelines wanted them to do. And so with that, I can honestly say that they made efforts. Of course, someone or like my colleague Richard could argue that this was the bottom line, was to make more profit, not necessarily to care for people's health. But yes, so they did that. And one thing or two key things that stand out clearly from these efforts, which aim at making sure that people are safe, there's some challenges which stand out, which still make health and safety during COVID precarious is that one is the fact that, and it's a criticism which can that mining companies were mostly screening, and it wasn't seen as an effective way to make sure that people are safe, because screening doesn't identify people who are, or doesn't pick up people who are asymptomatic. And mining sector being a sector that is already prone to TB and HIV, the argument was that it's not good to just screen. There's supposed to be testing to make sure that whoever goes in is not a risk to those people who already have comorbidities. And then another aspect, and which aligns with Hannah's challenges about the background where mine workers come from, which in my work I classified as the socio-geographic factors, while Hannah talked of socioeconomic and so on. Socio-geographic factors, I have two aspects, which one is that mine workers come from communities where COVID guidelines are not necessarily respected, and they're part of those communities. They can social distance at work, they can do what mining companies want them to do, but when they go back to the community, it's a completely different setting. So they still pose a threat to their colleagues at work. The other option is the hostels where they live, either hostels or where they live is that it's naturally or usually overcrowded. And that's one other challenge which makes social distancing or combating COVID in the sector a challenge. So those are the key things that are picked up. And I'm not sure if mining companies are making efforts to accommodate mining workers in a way that they are safe. Because I learned about what happened in Canada, where mining companies had hostels for mine workers where they would isolate for at least 2 weeks before they move back to the community or when they come back from the community. And I'm not sure if mining companies are doing something like that, but yeah, that's my main observation so far.
Thanks, Bernard. So I'd like to rope in Rafil, who's one of our panelists as well, to kind of elaborate on why is safety still a concern in South African mines? And with this relatively highly regulated sector, we see a continuous assessment of the compliance in order to maintain the mining rights we see. What are the contributions that you see the DMRE as well as the mine and health and safety committees? What are their contributions to curbing the COVID in mines, specifically those two institutions? If you wouldn't mind, Rafil, we're unmuting yourself and starting your video.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so the mining safety is dependent on 4 parties, or rather 4 people are responsible for the mining sector, which is the employees, the companies, the unions, as well as the regulatory structure. So I looked at what the regulations are saying in terms of safety and whether it has been implemented correctly in the mining industry. I also identified the types of things that contribute to safety, the main things which are accidents and safety, which are still a concern in South Africa even today. I mean, if you look at the statistics, you'll realize that there's still fatalities that occur from falls of ground. So for me, it was a concern that this industry is well regulated, and there's so many compliance that people need to, regulations that people need to adhere to, but we still come here in 2021 and these are still occurring even today. So what about COVID-19, which is a disease that affects, or something that affects safety the most? So what I did was to mainly look at the reports that we get from the mine, which gives us the image that COVID-19 was highly managed, especially if you look at individual reports. However, if you also go into the, sorry, can you please repeat the question? I think I'm drifting a bit.
No, I think you're on part. I'm just looking to maybe focus in on the DMRE and mine health and safety committees in particular? What are the types of measures you've seen coming from those two institutions?
Okay, yeah, so the two institutions, although we have been struggling with other types of incidents in the mines, I think in terms of COVID-19, they really did show up to provide guidelines for the mining industry. Both the DMRE and the Mine Health and Safety Act sat down together and compiled a code of practice, which are basically guidelines on how the mines have to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think they assisted in terms of also making sure that the mines remain compliant and people, the mining companies remain accountable. Yeah, so that's the word I want to say. So those two structures were there to make sure that everybody takes accountability in terms of COVID, and therefore it forced the mining industry to manage COVID better. And that's why even in their reports, you are able to see that a lot of COVID-19 protocols were put in place, such as screening, such as providing PPE and the likes, and providing also vaccination sites in the mines themselves. So I think the DMRE as well as the Mine Health and Safety Committees did their job in terms of assisting the mining industry, and the mining industry also responded positively to the regulations that were set.
Thank you so much, Rafilia, for that quite detailed answer. Sorry for the detailed question, I suppose. I'm now going to kind of take it out a little bit towards the bigger picture of Africa and the shock that we felt with COVID-19. And I'd like to direct this to you, Hanri, because I know you've done research on how various African countries have financed their responses to COVID-19. Have you seen any heartening or disheartening trends in this research?
Thank you, Aysha. I think we should also rope in our colleagues from the various other jurisdictions in Africa. But just to mention that a number of colleagues, Meyer van den Berg, Chris Kwache, and Casey Chisanga, worked together with me on a comparative project dealing with financing the crisis. And one of the things that was interesting was that Africa went into the COVID-19 pandemic as a continent. Africa went into the COVID-19 pandemic already on its knees. There were in West Africa and the Sahel region, there's been security concerns. Southern Africa was already dealing with the fallout of an extreme drought of several years. There were other extreme weather shocks, floods and cyclones. East Africa was experiencing a locust outbreak. These kind of crises extracted a heavy, barely affordable toll on African economies. And as we were studying, as we were comparing the different responses, it became very clear that the extent to which an African country was resourced before, resourced in terms of finances and infrastructure and those kind of resources, that had a significant influence on how well they were able to respond to the pressures exerted by the pandemic. And perhaps you could ask some of the colleagues who are in the room or in the virtual room with us. But what we've seen was that the responses were very different. So in some countries, the mines were closed completely, and in others, some parts of the mining sector were open, and in others, the mining sector wasn't that very much influenced. And that also, the extent to which the mining sectors in the different countries were influenced and could continue operations, that also had an influence on how well resourced they were to address the socioeconomic consequences following in the wake of these disasters. So perhaps other experiences might come.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to rope in Fatima to give us a Zambian perspective, and then after Fatima, if I could hear from Chris and then Robert. and they could all give us a perspective from across the African continent. Thanks, Fatima. Are you there for us? Not sure. Otherwise, if Robert wouldn't mind taking the floor and unmuting and sharing your video.
Hi, Aysha. Thanks again for moderating ever so well. And thank you, Prof. Hanri, for a fantastic introduction to the conversation. Apologies about that. So what we saw in Uganda was actually a very interesting point. I'll just take it from where Prof. Hanri left it, the varied response. So when COVID hit, our president is a bit paranoid when it comes to health matters. Health is his second most paranoid thing after security. So the instant reaction was lock down everything, lock down everyone. Stay home, don't move, don't go anywhere. And the problem with that is, oh, I'm so sorry about this. No. Sorry, I was muted. I'm taking the call from the room where the phone just won't stop going off. My sincere apologies. I was saying that the first reaction was lock down everything. There was no plan in the country for emergency response. And so the natural reaction was, okay, now that we've locked down everything, let's classify emergency sectors. And mining was not an emergency sector. Construction was, mining was not. So when you lock down everyone, you then completely miss the point that mines support a whole ecosystem and families, and it's not just an economic issue. So because you have a lot of undocumented activity in large artisanal mines and the big operators just stayed away because they were locked out of home. So you have the commercial side of the big operating mines that can take care of their employees and provide some sort of relief. But then you have the artisanal miners who I think were the hardest hit. And there you start to see different trends. The gender dimension of mining. We happen to be holding the world's longest, the record in the world now of having the longest school lockdown. And although we had gone a long way in solving child mining, that's now sort of been reversed because you keep kids out of school for over 50 weeks, but they must survive. And these are kids of single mothers in families that depend on artisanal mining. So what the child is going to do is to go back to the mine. And these were trends that I don't think anyone thought about. You had the economic disruption in the sense that the biggest support for the artisanal miners is having to move to Kampala, which is the capital, in some cases, 100 to 200 kilometers away from the capital to sell whatever they were able to buy. Now the buyers cannot come to them and they cannot go to Kampala. So even if they were to go into the mines illegally and mine, they have no one to sell the product to. So you have a complete mess in terms of the impact on the economic side, the impact on the social issues in terms of mitigating disruptions to the family, household incomes, but also in terms of health. The very basic measures, I mean, the message across the world was sanitize, social distance, wear a mask. It took about 2 months for the government of Uganda to give out free masks, and when they came, they were in short supply, mostly in the city. The COVID relief that was initially given out in round 1 was foodstuffs given out in communities in Kampala, basically addressing the urban poor. But these mines are in remote areas. So you had no interventions for the mining communities from the state. The second round of intervention, which was distributing money via the phone, was basically targeted on people who, so the state said, we're going to give 100,000 Uganda shillings, which would be maybe 20,000 rand, to anyone who has not received 500,000 Uganda shillings on their phone in the last 6 months. The problem is that there were so many assumptions in there that were wrong. The first is that anyone who has received 500,000 shillings received that money for their benefit. The second is that everyone has a mobile phone that has mobile money on it. The third is that it doesn't matter where people are, and yet we know that the ecosystem of a mine essentially has people who are living hand to mouth. Whether you're talking about the artisanal miner or the person who sells them the snack when they take a break, or you're talking about the cost of water that they have to depend on, this ecosystem was completely locked out. So in terms of just looking at the mining community as a unit per se, there was complete disruption, and I think it was most felt at the artisanal mining level. In terms of the larger and formalized, institutionalized mining, there was just basically a shutdown. The impact is still being felt. Every report that we've looked at in the country suggests that mining is going to be one of the slowest sectors to recover in the economy. And lastly, when you look at the public health measures that were put in place, one easily assumes that society or mining communities would operate just like every other sector, but we know this to not be true. So in terms of whether you're putting a ban on movement from district to district, one of the most active districts in Uganda for gold mining is Busia, which is on the border of Uganda and Kenya. When you ban them from moving into other districts in Kenya, into Uganda, they start smuggling into Kenya. So you have all this unintended consequence of having policy measures in place that do not take a sectoral approach to intervene. What do I think would be a better way to do it were we to face another pandemic? Because science is predicting that pandemics and epidemics will become more frequent as the pathogen economy gets more weaponized. Number one, I think that all people involved in the policy space in the mining sector need to think about just how essential mining is to whatever community they are in, and that eventually you end up with people that you would classify as being at risk for the three evil P's that were mentioned earlier: poverty and so on. If you think about the health implications, people will just not wear a mask when they are in a mine, period. So if you're going to provide vaccinations that are free, then maybe it would help to think about mining communities as a place where people need to go, because for them, it's not just, especially artisanal miners, it's not just about income, it really is basically survival. And unless we can think about the mine as a unit of survival, many people are going to struggle. Unlike what Richard pointed out earlier to be the South African case, where ultimately you have interventions that are profit driven. In Uganda, because most of the capital is foreign, what people did was, once the bosses are away, just shut down the mine. So if the owners of the mine are Chinese and they go back to China, which was even to this day is very strict on movement of persons from Uganda, then you basically have a shutdown of that entire ecosystem. If the miners are from Europe or from South Africa and they decide to go back home, then those mines are going to be shut down, which in and of itself is just as bad as sentencing these people to artisanal mining or uncontrolled movement that doesn't account for the public health concerns that are involved. So I think for me, the biggest concern again is to emphasize that at the end of the day, and this is a big question in all my research in this space, that mining has to be seen strategically as a sector. I don't think Uganda is there yet. I think that there's a long way to go in terms of prioritizing mining for its strategic interventions at the individual household level in terms of income, public health, safety, and security of communities, as well as the national interest in general. I'll leave it at that for now, Aysha.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was a very unique, and actually, I suppose, has patterns that we'll see across the various jurisdictions. So I'd like to invite Chris now to unmute himself and show us his face. And then I think he's actually already done this. But also to respond a little bit to Robert's introduction of another vulnerable group, which is the artisanal small-scale miner. So speaking from your perspective in Ghana, how has the government responded to COVID-19, specifically within the mining sector, I suppose not only the government, but industry as well? And what impacts have you seen within the artisanal small-scale mining sector? Thanks, Chris, over to you.
Chris sent a message saying that his power was too.
Oh no, we've lost Chris. Okay, well, I think I can rope in our other artisanal small-scale mining experts. Rebecca Payne, if you are available, we would love to get your insight, especially on how COVID-19, of course, has impacted this vulnerable sector.
Thanks so much, Aysha. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear and see. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for giving me the platform to speak. Thanks, Hanri. So at the outset, I'd like to just mention that there is a difference between legal and illegal artisanal and small-scale mining, and it's very important to make this distinction. In South Africa, for example, artisanal mining is not recognized. It's not regulated under any of the legislation, the MPRDA. This is just opposed to DRC, for example, that does regulate artisanal mining. So any activities that take place in the artisanal mining sector in South Africa are deemed illegal. Unlike in the DRC, if you do get the requisite mining permits, you will be considered a legal miner in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. So this is important, obviously, because with the rise of COVID and the outbreak of the pandemic, many of the artisanal mining sector, like any other economic sector, was negatively impacted. There's about roughly unaccounted for, unofficial, 45 million artisanal miners. This is that work directly in the artisanal mining sector, and about 30,000 artisanal miners in South Africa. And this artisanal mining sector was greatly impacted globally, mainly because when you have an economic crisis, the group that's always the most affected is the vulnerable population and those workers in the informal sector. It's the workers that need to rely on daily wages to cover their basic needs and usually have little savings to fall back on. So basically, this group is particularly vulnerable because they generally have poor healthcare, precarious working conditions, high incidences of respiratory diseases, and there's exposure of vulnerable groups in an environment of little government oversight. So recently, when I was doing my research, I recently came across it was like a documentary interview that SABC did with Zama-Zamas, which is what you call artisanal miners in South Africa. And they were just doing a little segment on how artisanal miners are impacted during COVID and how their work's been affected. And yeah, basically in this documentary, they were just exposing how nothing much has really changed. I mean, this is unsurprising considering the fact that artisanal mining is illegal and whether they were never regulated, so they would probably carry on working in the mines underground. And they interviewed a few of them, the artisanal miners, and the artisanal miners said, you know, we have to carry on working because if we don't, we will die. We need food, we need to put food on the table. And so regardless of the lockdown, the national lockdown that took place in South Africa, they had to continue going underground, and they realized the risks of the spread of the virus. But for them, as I remember one of the miners commented, I'd rather go underground and risk getting sick than staying at home and risking the virus and hunger. So I think also what's important to bear in mind is that artisanal mining often, especially in other jurisdictions, but also in South Africa, often takes place in remote areas. And with these remote areas comes limited access to healthcare services. And although the remoteness might mean that there's a delay, there might have been a delay in the initial exposure to the virus, Most communities are obviously connected to urban centers because of migrant workers or goods and service chain supplies and mineral trade. So it was inevitable that the virus would spread to some of the outskirts and the remote artisanal communities. And as Robert put it very eloquently, that these communities suffered greatly. And I know that through my studies, I saw that there was a lot of, through my research, sorry, I saw that the remoteness of the artisanal mining communities was mainly because they weren't able to screen people and test people early enough. There was limited access to COVID-19 information. They couldn't sufficiently isolate the affected populations, and also they couldn't treat those cases where they required hospitalization or respiratory support. They also weren't able to follow the recommended preventative measures due to infrastructural barriers, as Robert mentioned, such as lack of water supply, hand sanitizers, soap, disinfectants. And although artisanal miners tend to be quite young, healthy guys that go underground, a lot of the mine workers, not all of them, but some of the mine workers have underlying conditions related to occupational health, such as tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, hypertension, diabetes, mercury-induced organ damage. And of course, this has all been made worse because they've had to work, they have a history of working underground in the mines. And this, of course, these types of occupational health risks increase the severity of the virus. ASAM, which is short for artisanal small-scale mining, is also a poverty-driven activity. And as a result, as I think Aysha mentioned, there's a lot of malnutrition. No, sorry, not Aysha, Hannah. There's communicable diseases such as Ebola and the lack of hygiene, which also further causes a severity of COVID-19. Yeah, let me hurry because I'll just say that obviously a lot of miners working in the artisanal mining sector are immigrants, and immigrants usually cross borders, and this of course increased the risk of COVID spreading across borders. And finally, I suppose the productivity of mine sites and miner income was severely impacted because of complications with supply chains, labor disruptions, and government lockdowns, and also because there was a temporary suspension of maritime and transportation and air traffic. So this obviously impacted the demand for minerals, which impacted miners' income. And yeah, so in summary, I suppose that artisanal mining was probably one of the worst hit because, particularly in South Africa, because there is no sort of regulatory measures in place for artisanal miners because they aren't regulated or recognized in the mining sector in South Africa by the DMRE or in the MPRDA. Yeah, and I know that they have a code of practice on mitigation and management of COVID-19 outbreak, which requires, this is a piece of legislation that requires mining companies to regulate mines, to regulate their miners. They have to follow a whole lot of occupational health and safety requirements. And I suppose artisanal miners won't be regulated by this because they're not regulated under South African law. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And last thing I want to say is, of course, last thing is also mining unions came out and supported, and mining companies came out and supported a lot of miners during this time. But of course, artisanal miners are not protected by these unions because they're not regulated. So yeah, they're a very vulnerable group of society.
Thanks, Rebecca. I see that we have Fatima and Chris back online. So I think I'll hand over to Chris, who will also be speaking about artisanal scale miners briefly and the impacts of COVID-19 in Ghana. So if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and sharing your video, and we'll get up. Chris, thanks.
Right, thank you very much, Aysha. The problem in Ghana was basically not, the lockdown was not in all it was not countrywide. It was basically at the epicenter where the population is very thick. So it was in Accra, Kumasi, and then parts of Central region. Now, for the mainstream miners, they did not have any problem. They continued because they are regulated, and then they were able to contain the surge of COVID-19. But the challenge was with artisanal mining and then small-scale miners. Now, there is a peculiar problem in Ghana, and that is to do with small-scale miners. In some cases, some of the politically exposed persons get license. And when they get the license, what they do is that they sell the parcel of land that has been granted to them to people who have the money, and then they engage these artisanal miners to come and work there for some amount of money. Now, because of the problem of lack of social distancing, not putting on nose masks, and also if you look at the places they work, they were exposed. And so when the government realized that the surge in that area was increasing, what the government did was to move in and then try to control their activities. And for example, in some areas, when you do the reading, they resorted to operating in the night, deep down in the night. And the lockdown also brought some form of hardship on them, because in Ghana, there's a policy where school children are fed. They give them hot meal, particularly those in basic schools. So the lockdown was there. Their parents were not getting any income. They were not going out. And then they also had these additional mouths to feed, because most of the children had to stay at home. They did not have any means of going out to do any work. So that is what particularly happened in Ghana. And then there was another challenge in that sector. Because of the lockdown, people normally come from the neighboring countries to come and buy. And some of them also sell to the precious mineral company in Ghana. And so you do the work, people have not come to buy. And so sometimes you even have the leaders, those who employ them, saying that we did the work, we have not had anyone coming to buy. So I also don't have any money, we have to wait. So people come to buy before I would be able to pay you. Now, there were instances where some of them had to, they engage in confrontation with the people who employed them, but the government then had to come in with some poverty alleviation mechanisms. And so they decided that in some areas, they were going to give them a hot meal. And the cost of that was so much that the government also had to rely on a lot of donor agencies. Ghana, for example, Parliament approved about 4 types of loans, totaling about $600 million, just to help the government meet some of these challenges. We also had some philanthropists coming to the aid of some of these communities, making sure that out of their own, they will get food and medicines to them so that their hardship or what they were going through would come down. So basically, that is what happened in Ghana with respect to the effect of COVID on mining. The big time mining companies did not experience much challenges, but the challenge was with the artisanal miners and then the small scale miners.
Thanks, Chris, for giving us that perspective on ASM in Ghana. So I'd like to now just hand over to Fatima, if we still have you on the line. I hope we do. And just to give us the Zambian perspective on COVID-19 restrictions, and maybe also connect with the impact on the international, regional, and national restrictions that you've seen in the production processes in mines. Fatima, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but I'll keep the video. I will not connect to the video because the internet connection is a bit problematic here. So I'll just talk if that is okay.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, I will. In the case of Zambia, once the COVID pandemic was declared, the government took measures in enacting new pieces of regulations so that the disease could be, the spread of the disease should be controlled to some extent. And this has affected the mining companies in Zambia. And one of the cases that came up, which I thought is quite interesting, was the case of Glencore, which is Zambia's subsidiary for mining copper mines. Zambian economy is basically copper mine based, and this had a real effect on the mining sector when the mining company Mopani decided to announce some plans to put the mine under care and maintenance, and in other words, cease production. They cited the impact of the rapid decline of the copper prices as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, which had critically disrupted their international mobility, transportation and supply chains, leading to a rise in the cost of producing copper. And this announcement was made to the Zambian government to say that they will suspend production within 90 days of notice. And the Minister of Mines would then have to be engaged. Nevertheless, the Minister of Mines did report to the company and tell them that if they were going to introduce frustration of contract or use force majeure, then the problem would be they were risking 11,000 jobs of their miners. And we stated that it would be very difficult for them to argue for frustration of the contract because the events did not make mining impossible, but they had to continue the mining despite the high production rate as well as all the financial costs that would go into implementing the COVID-19 restriction. The conflict then escalated, and the Zambian authorities, eventually through the Minister of Mines, decided to say that Mopani's licenses should be revoked. Eventually, after further negotiation, the company did back down, but they agreed to start the mining operations, provided that the 90 days notice of intention to put the mine under care and maintenance would be followed. Now, from this, it is very clear that government had several challenges when it came to the mining sector, because the mine was basically saying that due to COVID-19, they would then put many of these mines under care and maintenance. And they cited COVID-19 as the biggest hurdle that they had to overcome in order to meet all their contractual obligations. However, it's very difficult to implement frustration of the contract in these circumstances. And the law, it seems, is clear because Zambia follows English law that you would have to consider lots of issues that are pre-contractual, or if the contract is frustrated, all the circumstances that would result from non-compliance of the obligations before frustration can be allowed. So most of the mining companies were of the view that the government should introduce further help to assist them. And therefore, the Ministry of Mines came up with a tax relief package to try and see if they can relieve the mining industry from some of the financial circumstances that had become evident due to the pandemic. In addition to that, also the government came up with what was called the Employment Code Exemption Regulations, so that some of the financial burdens that were being placed during the pandemic, where most of the workers could not come to work, to suspend the requirement of payment of the basic pay during the period of forced leave, so that the employees could stay at home, but the company then had to follow the regulations of being declared as a company under financial distress. If they met the regulations, then the government would assist in making sure that they would get some financial help in that way. So these were the two things. The last thing that the government did was the implementation of the health regulations. The issue of making sure that when employees did come to work, that the social distancing, the issue of wearing a mask, to ensure that they were vaccinated later on, obviously, and also the fact that not everybody was put in that enclosed environment where they could not breathe properly. All these measures had to be put in place. And the argument from the mining company was, of course, these regulatory requirements were difficult to implement. And because the regulations said that there would be punitive measures, including 6 months imprisonment and a hefty fine, it became obvious that some of the companies could not abide by all these regulations. And basically what they attempted to do was to close the mining operations for at least a period of 3 months before being told to go back and reconsider putting the mining under care and maintenance. In conclusion, of course, there were several factors that affected the mining industry apart from the COVID-19, but it seems COVID-19 regulations have made it difficult in terms of following the policies as well as the regulations, and the government really has to exercise some leniency in terms of implementations of these regulations or measures. And the policies that have to be drawn up have to take into consideration the angle on the both sides, from the mining company as well as the benefits of the employees who are working in the mining company and the government itself. So we have to strike some sort of a balance in terms of coming up with new policies and regulations to curb the impact of COVID-19 on mining in Zambia.
Thank you, Fatima. That was really fascinating to hear the Zambian perspective. So I'll just read out what the letter said, and it kind of responds to your concerns around actually getting move on with regulatory interventions. So from a regulatory perspective, COVID-19 has completely challenged the DMRE and affected the ordinary functioning of the department. It is going to be very difficult for the DMRE to deal with backlogs in applications, appeals, etc. The DMRE is less proactive than what has been described in health and safety, and we still are relying on directives that were published in April 2020. So we can also speak to that Daletta a little bit later, because I want to bring you in towards the end of the discussion, you as well as Patrick, who will speak more about the future and what are we going to see on the horizon post, well, not necessarily post this pandemic, because I think we will be functioning within the COVID-19 parameters for quite some time, but maybe seeing into the future. Before I move on, though, to maybe I also want to touch on Kennedy and Bongani for more industry perspectives. I want to still stick with this African panel, because now we have representatives from South Africa, we have Zambia, Ghana, Uganda, as well as Ghana. So Before we move on, I want to address Francis's question to all four of you. How did governments work with the mining sector to create additional intellectual and distributive capacities in dealing with managing COVID-19 and the subsequent vaccine rollout? So I think you've spoken quite a bit to managing COVID-19, but I would like to hear a bit more about what you've seen with the COVID vaccine rollout in these sectors. So I'd like to hand over to Hanri first, and then just to keep you all kind of ready, I'll ask Robert, and then Chris, and then Fatima to speak. Quite relatively briefly, if we can stick to our answers within 2 minutes so that we can continue with the panel.
I'll be very brief, Aysha. I didn't study this in detail, but I'm aware of an 2021 IMF report that forecasted that African economies are going to, African economies that are less resource intensive will recover better from the pandemic. And I found that a quite interesting perspective. And looking at worldwide recovery, it really does seem as if recovery depends on many factors: the availability of vaccines, the take-up of pharmaceutical solutions in society, but also distributive infrastructure and the resources for that distribution. And it seems as if to enable that recovery, many African states, and my colleagues might confirm or refute this, had to turn to lending. And lending under quite difficult circumstances, which creates a further threat on the spectre on the horizon, which is the possibility of defaulting on sovereign debt. I'm going to leave it there because it might be opening another, a whole other possibility, but just as a brief response to the question.
Thank you. So I'm going to hand over now to Robert.
So, Prof, I think you have opened a vein that we need to sort of pull the string out of a thread out of the cloth that I cannot resist picking up on. And that is the connection between COVID-19, sovereign debt, and natural resources. I think that's an issue that we must study tremendously, because at the end of the day, I mean, I'll give you the statistics on Uganda. Uganda has taken over $1.5 billion in debt. For context, in 2009, Uganda's sovereign debt was $1.9 billion. 2009 is 12 years ago. Pre-COVID, Uganda's debt was $12 billion. So in a decade, we've jumped by almost 10 billion. During COVID, Uganda took IMF money in excess of $1.5 billion. I would say that's disproportionate in terms of just how much the debt has grown. The economy is struggling because central bank is saying to bankers, do not collect. So while the economy is struggling and stuck, and the Chinese have come in for natural resources, by the way, most of that 10 billion in the middle is Chinese loans. I think that we would be remiss as scholars to ignore the connection that this pressure is obviously going to go and hit natural resources in ways that we have not thought about before. So I just want to A, agree with what you said, and B, suggest that any of us who's looking into Africa, sovereign debt and mining needs to think about COVID as an accelerator for that threat that has always been lurking in the horizon. I think we will probably see this get worse in this decade, or not even later, because again, when you look at the move to energy transition and oil being where it is, that pressure is definitely going to come to minerals and metals. But going back to the question that Aysha asked, on vaccination. So here is the problem with the Ugandan context. Vaccination was considered as a health issue. So you have this siloing of government, that the Ministry of Health is in charge of vaccination, that's their problem. So the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, where minerals fall, is not concerned with vaccination. It's a complete policy mess, in the sense that no one has drawn the connection. One would think that almost 2 years after COVID started, we would have figured out that government should never be this siloed. But because vaccination was a Ministry of Health issue, you had no direct intervention in terms of making sure communities were vaccinated quickly. So Uganda has only now this week hit the 4.8 million target towards herd immunity, to sort of create the base for herd immunity. But there's vaccine apathy. People don't want to get the vaccine for whatever reason. So many of us got the vaccine out of necessity. I have children, I go to public places, I practice law, I teach law, I want to travel. For whatever 7 reasons that I might have, it was important to get vaccinated. The people in the village believe the vaccine, has the mark of the beast, 666 in the Bible. So the West is going to control us, let alone going to affect fertility. And in Uganda, that is a big deal. The running joke is that if they had wanted it to work, they should have just said it improves fertility. That would have just solved the problem. People would have gotten vaccinated quickly. The sad reality is that what is on ground is actually the direct opposite. People are fearing that, the science is unproven in regard to its impact on fertility, and that in remote Uganda is definitely going to keep people away from the vaccine booths. So you've had no direct intervention in mining communities to make sure they're vaccinated. You've had no direct policy intervention to make sure that even just awareness and sensitization. And third, the issue of exclusion. The way the vaccine mandate was handed down was to say, first, we will start with those who are above 60. Then we will go to those who work in government. Then we will go to the doctors. It's ironic that doctors who were on the front line were actually third in line. By the time they opened it up to everyone else, the first batch of vaccines was expiring and completely useless. And then when you finally have more vaccines for as much as you need to vaccinate, people just don't want to get the vaccine because no one has told them, since you're in a crowded place, i.e. a mine, it is important for you, for everyone's safety, to get vaccinated. As obvious as it sounds, this message did not get down as well as wash your hands, sanitize, wear a mask, which all three most people couldn't do because, water costs money. A vaccine, a mask is too expensive at $2 a piece. And, social distance, what do you mean? I have to go and dig. I have to go and mine. I have to go and get the mineral. So there will need to be a more pointed, at least in the Ugandan context, a more pointed approach towards sensitizing. And this takes me back to the need to look at the mine, not just as a workplace, but really as the fulcrum of a whole ecosystem in society at the micro level. And then at the macro level, obviously the larger issues, such as the ones that Prof. Hanri has just pointed out now.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was really interesting, especially the dissemination issues that you've highlighted. It's interesting how public relations really plays a key role there. So I'd like to hand over to Chris, who will give us a quick overview of this question, specifically looking at vaccine rollout in Ghana.
Right. Now, I think contrary to what Robert expressed, we had a different situation taking place in Ghana. Like he said, when the lockdown was opened, most expatriates who were coming down had vaccinated. And so what most of the multinationals did was that they even helped the government to facilitate the vaccination of persons who were working in the mines because of the effect of not being vaccinated and the fact that the expatriates who have come also needed protection. So in some of the mining companies, the issue of myth raised by Robert is also very, very, very high in Ghana. And some of the miners decided that if they say, if I'm a man, and I go and take the vaccine, I'm going to be impotent. So most of them said that they wouldn't do it. And so some of the minds tried to convince them that it is for your good. And when some of them still were adamant, then they introduced no vaccine, no entry. So some of them, when that policy came up, what they did was that they had to agree to go and take the vaccine and then be able to work. But the rate at which people are vaccinating in Ghana generally is not encouraging at all. Like Robert said, for some of us, we have to travel, we have to do some, get to some places. And if you do not have the certificate of having vaccinated, you are not going to be allowed. But the rate, particularly in the mining communities, those working in the proper mines, I can say that it is very good because of the coordination between the mining companies and the Ministry of Health with respect to ensuring that the population in the mining companies do take their vaccines. But when you come outside, it is a different story because of the myth.
Thank you so much, Chris. Fatima, would you mind bringing us to the Zambian perspective?
Okay, in terms of Zambia's vaccine rollout, I'm sure Zambia would be last on the list because firstly, the securing of vaccine that was done by the Ministry of Health, there were big issues around that. And nobody was really sure which vaccine actually would come in, and there was always resistance on who would be entitled to those vaccines and who would actually take those vaccines. The mining company, what really touched me once was one of the mining companies had its employees who were vaccinated wear a little tag which says, "I'm vaccinated, so I'm protecting you and myself." And I thought that was rather nice, so that it encourages anybody who sees that to feel that they should also be vaccinated. The distribution of vaccines is another huge issue. Nobody seems to know who is responsible for doing that. Of course, as my colleague from Ghana explained, as well as from Uganda, that this was compartmentalized with Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Health did what they thought was the best thing to do, and how they distributed the vaccine became a big issue. Last but not least, there was a lot of talk on how it would be possible to buy the vaccine, because there is now talk with the private pharmaceutical companies to say if it's possible for them to secure the different types of vaccines so that people who needed it would be able to access it. I think I'll end it.
Thank you so much. Just kind of to overshoot a little bit of what we've gone through now. We've seen a bit of big picture analysis from Hanri, and we've spoken about the historical context that we find ourselves in general, the kinds of trends that we've seen within the mining sector, but we've also put it into the migrant workers context. I know there's a few comments in the chat that I haven't addressed yet, but do be a little patient. I will come to them, or you may raise your hand at any point, and we will get you on the stage with us. So we've spoken about health and safety, and then we've also had this country-specific case-by-case study from various experts within the different countries in Africa. So now I want to go more into the industry mining companies perspective, and I'd like to hand over to you, Kennedy, to look at how maybe small industries have been impacted and the kind of adaptation that has been forced upon them to try and exist in this new environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Aysha, Hanri, for this opportunity to present my research. So with regards to my research, I'm looking at the commercial aspects in terms of the effects of COVID on mining companies in South Africa. So before COVID, the mining sector was still in a state of financial distress, but the pandemic made the situation worse. And then it's not just the effects of COVID, but then also we've had issues such as the the clean energy transition, which has also caused financial distress for mining companies, as well as other factors, including the regulations, which was also mentioned by Professor Fatima. So for these mining companies that are financially distressed, it appears that the most viable solution for them is to restructure. Many of them are restructuring their portfolios and debts by carving out or by divesting their infrastructures and other non-essential and underperforming assets, also reducing staff and retrenchments to save costs, etc. But one common way that these mining companies are restructuring in order to save costs is through engaging corporate mergers and acquisitions, corporate M&As. And this, when you're dealing specifically with the distressed mining companies, it is referred to as distressed M&As. This is one of the common features, not just in South Africa, but globally. So the corporate M&As have been quite popular in South Africa. It has been a key feature mostly in 2020 and even up to this point in 2021, and will continue to be a major feature globally and in South Africa going forward, at least in the foreseeable future. So some of the key trends, if we can move to the key trends that we're likely going to see in the coming year. So firstly, as I've mentioned, having been a key feature throughout 2020, there will be a wave of restructuring and corporate M&As by those that are unable to survive in their present form, who will actually collaborate with other companies to form stronger companies and to build resilience. That is one of the key trends. Secondly, we're also likely to see more and more investors that will capitalize on the opportunities for mergers as assets become available. As I mentioned, the companies, especially smaller companies, the small, medium, and macro enterprises looking to sell off assets to save costs. So these assets are going to become more available in the market, and investors are going to capitalize on these opportunities for mergers. Lastly, COVID has also revealed the need for businesses to transform and to safeguard their future. This is by these companies looking to make strategic acquisitions to fill gaps in technology and the supply chains that may have been exposed by the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Kennedy. That was really insightful. So I wanted to also give us a little bit of a roadmap for the last half an hour of the session, because we've been bombarded with such amazing information, but I don't want to lose steam. So this last section, we're going to focus in on a few specific topics. We'll have Bongani, who will speak specifically to the petroleum sector, and we will have Patrick, who will speak to resource revenue. That will be Mwabo. I've got you right next to each other and I got the two mixed up. Sorry. Mwabo, you'll be speaking, of course, as you know, to resource revenue management. And Patrick will speak to the recovery and the challenges that we have with recovery. And last but not least, of course, we'll have Delette, who will speak to the fourth industrial revolution and the just energy transition. So I think we have a lot of very high impact topics to still get through. So if we can just dive straight in with Bongani, who will speak to petroleum. And I'd like to ask you one question here. What country decisions have led to significant decline, specifically in the crude oil price in early 2021? And how did this pandemic compound these decisions? Thanks so much. And I hand over to you, Bongani.
Thank you. Thanks, Aysha, and good afternoon, everyone. For relevance, I would like to locate my contribution within the context of mining for oil and gas. I guess oil and gas being more fluid commodities than hard rock minerals. In fact, the COVID-19 coincided with the oil price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia in early 2020 actually. Russia had defied the OPEC call to cut oil production by some 1.5 million barrels per day. And this was around in early March 2020. 2 days later, Saudi Arabia retaliated by announcing that they would in turn increase production by some 3 million barrels of oil per day. In fact, 3.3 or 3 million barrels per day is almost like the combined production of the top 3 oil producers in Africa, which is Nigeria at around 1.4 million barrels per day, Angola at about 1.3, and Libya at about 1.1. So in essence, Saudi Arabia had said they are going to flood the market with oil equivalent to the oil produced by these 3 major oil producers in Africa. So then that created, or the anticipated glut in crude oil immediately reduced the oil price to very low levels. In fact, on a particular day, the WTI, which is the West Texas indexation of oil, or oil price in North America, went to negative levels. This was because it was anticipated there would be so much oil such that those that held oil wanted to get rid of their oil, and there was no storage anywhere in the world. So they would actually pay others to take the oil off their hands, because there was nowhere oil was being could take the oil. So when COVID-19 exacerbated the problem, when it resulted to only essential travel, which reduced demand for motor fuels, jet fuel, ship fuels, leading to an oversupply of these petroleum products. That led to refinery closures. In South Africa, for example, a number of refineries closed because the refinery margins or profit margins had diminished. It didn't make sense for you to be producing anything because you would not be making any money. That put a lot of jobs at risk. And that oversupply of finished products then reduced demand in terms of crude oil further, and pushed the oil price to unsustainable levels, last seen 2 decades ago. We saw towards the end of March, oil price reaching $23 per barrel. And most companies, in terms of oil producing companies and countries, could actually shut down at that oil price. So that then resulted in the petroleum industry reconsidering planned upstream projects or investments. We saw big projects delayed or cancelled. We saw capital expenditure being cut significantly by some 20% or so compared to 2019, or equivalent to 100 billion US dollars, which in rand terms at 15 rand per dollar being 1.3 trillion. So projects that would have cost 1.3 or 1.5 trillion were cancelled or delayed and so on. R&D budgets were also cut, potentially curtailing innovation and resultant efficiencies in terms of the upstream petroleum sector. We saw these major African oil producing countries, Nigeria, Angola, suffering much more immensely economically because they are heavily reliant on their crude oil production. For example, Nigeria being 50% plus reliant on oil revenues in terms of the government revenues, and over 90% of their foreign exchange earnings is based on oil exports. And more than half of their revenues are used to service foreign debt. So, and leaving therefore very limited resources to mitigate the effects of COVID-19, for example. South Africa was also significantly impacted, but to a lesser extent than the major oil producers in Africa, because the country is not a notable producer of oil and gas. It's a diversified economy, spanning mining, agriculture, manufacturing, and financial services. So we were lesser impacted being a non-oil producer in the context of directly by the oil price. No, in fact, yes,
Sorry.
Aysha?
No, go for it. I've just been itching to ask you this question, and I was wondering if I could throw next, and you can continue your thought, but please, please, I would love to hear your views as CEO of PetroSA. It's a really interesting question for me. What do you see? Should we really be investing in oil and gas in the current light that we have with our economic stress because of the pandemic, but also we're seeing this movement away from oil and gas industries post COP26 and the net zero emissions by 2050. What is your opinion on that?
No, in fact, thanks, Aysha, for that. The COVID-19 and the net zero carbon pledges will be cut or have curtailed and will continue to curtail investment. And you therefore need other enablers to unlock oil and gas resources. But should there still be investment in terms of oil and gas, in the context of the climate change, the move to a lower carbon world, pledges that by 2050 we should have moved to a net zero carbon emissions. The implication is that you need to be moving, the world needs to be moving to renewable energy sources. For example, need to be moving to solar, wind, and so on. And maybe there's a sentiment that's emerging that perhaps should not just be moving away from coal, but also as a major contributor in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, but also from oil and gas. My take is there still needs to be investment, particularly or in the upstream petroleum sector, particularly in gas. Gas is a transitional fuel in the transition towards a lower carbon world. You need uninterrupted supply of energy, which solar, wind, and so on cannot guarantee. Those energy generated from those sources is still grappling with how to ensure that that energy is uninterrupted. For example, we still have energy at night when there is no sun to generate the energy. We still have energy when there is no wind. So it's those technologies still grapple with storage. How do you store the energy created by the sun and be able to use it at night when there is no sun? So, and gas being much cleaner than coal in terms of the burning thereof, 50% cleaner than coal, 30% cleaner than oil, is going to then play that transitional role of bridging as we move away from coal, for example. So that's my take. There should still be investment, but maybe the investment should be shifting more towards gas as a bridging fuel. And as we develop these technologies, in terms of renewable technologies, further and further, and develop the ability to store them, therefore we have uninterrupted supply of energy.
Thank you so much, Bongani. That was really enlightening. I know I cut you off, so if you wanted to finish your thought, please do so. Otherwise, I'll hand over, or at least warn Mwaba that I'd like to rope her into the conversation next. So
no, Aysha, I think in the interest of time, let's go on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Mwaba, if you wouldn't mind joining us, I'd like to ask you about resource revenue management. and specifically what mechanisms or systems have been implemented for the management of mineral resource revenue, and what regulatory body has been operating in the space, and what kind of agendas and targets are you seeing come through this, these management strategies?
Thank you for that, Aysha. To start off, maybe what I'd like to say just briefly on revenue management, I'll draw back to what Dr. Mandu was saying about production and how resources were dropped in that period. And for, so for that specific period, mining industries have been affected because they have recorded lower levels of production, and also there was the issue with the biggest mine being Mopani, and it almost going on that forced shutdown, and the loss and possible loss of employment for those many employees. But then when you look at different statistics which are compared between January to June 2020, you see that there was actually an increase in the revenue that was collected from the Zambia Revenue Authority from the mining industry. And then when you look at also, and this is supposedly the period at which COVID was at its peak in different countries, you look also at different figures for this year, for 2021 especially, and the ZRA actually speaks to the fact that they have recorded more than they've ever recorded in various years. So then it gives you this picture where the mines have a reduction, or they're recording a reduction in production, but then the revenue authority is able to record this increase because the prices of the commodities are also fluctuating, and the revenue authority is able to project that they'll continue receiving more revenue from these mining companies, regardless of the situation that these companies are finding themselves in because of COVID. And then that puts us in a situation as a country to say, okay, we're able to project that we'll have more revenue, but what is it that we're going to do with this revenue? Because if we don't have a proper plan for this revenue, you have a situation where, for instance, in August 2021, the ZRA decided to give back some of this revenue to mining companies because they said that they had recorded so much of it exceeded their revenue projections. But then, so what does this mean for a country like Zambia, which is mineral dependent, or is said to be mineral dependent, and we are struggling, or we're trying to find strategies that will help us bounce back from the effects of COVID? So for me, that then brings the issue of revenue management to the discussion, because then there should be a clear plan and a clear regulatory framework to specify how the revenue is generated and how it's going to be utilized. Because we might find ourselves back in a situation as was previously the case when Zambia was really famous for copper production, but there is really not much to show for it because it's not being channeled into intergenerational wealth, which is really necessary for where Zambia is after the pandemic. And I'll also just speak to the fact that because of the pandemic, as many presenters here have mentioned, different sectors of the economy have come to now be known as priority sectors. For instance, the health sector, and this then also affects how a country is able to plan for its other sectors going forward. So this gives Zambia the opportunity to have the mining sector as the center of producing this revenue and being able to manage that revenue in a way that it kind of cushions and supports these other sectors as well, which are also now being considered as priority sectors over the mining sector, such as the health sector. And so in my research, I focused specifically on how legally there should be a framework for the management of this revenue that's being generated from the sector, as this would then provide for a basis to keep the reinvestment of the revenue in different sectors and in different sectors of the economy, and help the country recover even from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Marwa. That was really enlightening as well. I'm going to have to ask you more detailed questions at some other point.
No problem.
So, Patrick, I'd like to ask you a bit about the recovery and the use of the mining sector in our recovery post, or at least managing better the COVID-19 pandemic, and what kinds of challenges you expect with using the mining sector to resolve some of our experiences, and maybe posit some solutions to those challenges. So I'm going to throw you in the deep end there, if you wouldn't mind joining us. Unmute yourself, and there we go. Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, thanks, Aysha. Good afternoon, colleagues. So essentially, what I was trying to look at when doing this article, this commentary piece, I was essentially trying to look at how the mining sector can help kickstart our economy, or lead the country's lead the country into an economic recovery, So as you would have known, colleagues, when COVID-19 arrived on our shores, the Statistics South Africa had already declared that we were in a technical recession. So this already, brought around fears that, the economy was going to suffer because of the pandemic and the lockdown that we were experiencing. And yes, the economy did suffer. But what we saw was that we saw positive trends from the mining sector. And these trends, I think, show that the mining sector is probably the unlikely savior, for our economy. So mining is the historic bedrock of South Africa's economy. We have seen its contribution to the GDP of the country, and we cannot underestimate mining as a sector. So what essentially I started looking at was the contribution of mining to the country's GDP. And what I realized, and what is common is, or what is common knowledge, is that the mining value chain has a very, very, very huge impact on our economy. For example, what I found out was, the Northern Cape, Northwestern Limpopo, according to the South African GDP statistics, informs us that the mining industry is huge in those 4 provinces. And it doesn't mean that the other provinces do not contribute to the country's economy. They do, but these 4 provinces contribute huge amounts of revenue to our country's fiscus. And it is estimated that the total contribution of these 4 provinces that I've mentioned to our country's total mining gross value added with regard to all mining activities was more than 50%, just with those 4. So, and in terms of statistics, according to SARChi again, it shows us that in 2019 and 2020, between those financial years, the number of jobs created directly or indirectly estimated to be at 1.5 million to 1.8 million, respectively. Finally, government revenue is said to have been 165.7 billion rands in 2019 and 173.7 billion rands in 2020, as a result of direct and indirect taxes collected by the taxmen. So we have seen, I've just mentioned how in a nutshell, how the mining sector contributes to our fiscal. But it has also its challenges, and COVID-19 has shown us that there are still challenges that need to be addressed. by different people. And those challenges are infrastructure and operational challenges that I will go into. I'll mention technological aspects of it, as well as policy and legislation. So the first discussion on infrastructure and operational challenges, I think, is ESCOM. It's ESCOM, and the issue of electricity is becoming a problem. So in the past, we have seen ESCOM telling mining companies such as Harmony to reduce their power consumption, you know. And yes, there are different levels to the load shedding. And I think from mining companies have reported that when they are forced to, when load shedding goes into, you know, when load shedding is activated by ESCOM, level 3 and level 4 impacts their production levels. And this, I think, is a huge problem, because if we're going to have electricity challenges, it's not only the mining sector that suffers, it's everyone that suffers, you know. All other sectors of the economy will suffer, and therefore our economy, you know, will be left vulnerable. So one of the solutions to this issue, that to solve the electricity challenges, is the South Africa's embedded generation changes that will boost the energy security. The embedded generation changes will also attract investment in the sector, because investors will be assured of energy security and will be assured that, you know, disruptions in the mining sector will be left to a minimum. Another issue I want to speak about quickly is technology. So South Africa's mining sector lags in terms of technology compared to other regions. And other regions, I'm speaking about Australia and so on and so forth. However, one also notes that the mining, you know, the mining sector in South Africa, especially the companies, are slow in adopting technologies. But this does not mean that there has not been progress in the digitalization or in the industry. There has been digitalization in the industry, but it has not been effective, or it has been slow. So the other issue, again, I want to speak about quickly is policy and legislation. So there needs to be a fair mining tax regime that is needed in South Africa, and that was also spoken about in detail by the Davis Tax Committee, that had explained that there were legislative inconsistencies in the mining industry, and those were supposed to be addressed. So yeah, so those are some of the challenges that we are facing in the mining industry. But what I want to also mention, and what is of importance, is that if the mining industry can address these challenges, it can help the economy currently, because we have seen debates around, for example, the basic income grant, and people asking questions of where will the money come from, you know, and some saying government has the money and it's there and it's so on and so forth. But what I want to address is that if mining is able to operate, you know, without disruption, it can contribute to the fiscus of the country. So, and this revenue will help the country, because, you know, it can help government deal with socioeconomic rights issues that we are facing currently. For example, with the triple challenges, as you know, the high level of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So the value chain of the mining industry, if mining companies are operating and do not have the challenges, there's clear legislation, there's clear policy, you know, infrastructure is at its highest and it's operating very well, the revenues that they'll be getting, government can take it through, you know, the tax and contribute it to, and contribute it towards fighting inequality, fighting poverty and unemployment. So let me see if I've missed anything. So yes, so just to say, I think when the lockdown came into effect, we saw how important mining was to the country, that the president had declared it essential, and I think also it was not operating at full capacity. I think it was 50% capacity, but still we saw that, for example, South African exports of platinum group metals surged 40% in 2020, despite the COVID-19 disruption. And if truly the sector can operate again, can operate without challenges and so on and so forth, it can stabilize our growing debt, you know, because we have our growing debt, you know, national debt, and it needs to be addressed. So, and I think that mining can contribute immensely to this, to the economy and to government. So yeah, I think that's what I have for now.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So I know that we're sitting in 2 minutes left of our panel discussion, and I know that we've had your attention for 2 hours, but I really do want the next 10 minutes at least. Yes, I would say let's leave it at 10, just to touch base with the fourth industrial revolution and the just energy transition, which is really the next steps that we're taking. So Delette, if you wouldn't mind joining us, I'd like to ask you about these two concepts, how they're in sync, and perhaps whether they undermine one another, and what are we looking for in these two kind of visions for the future. Delette, if you wouldn't mind joining us.
Thank you so much, Aysha. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on this panel, and also I've really enjoyed listening to all of the speakers, and also, you know, working at a Pan-African focused law firm. It's very interesting for me to hear about all the developments on the continent. So I think my research specifically on the fourth industrial revolution and the just energy transition, it picks up on many themes that have already been discussed, but in some ways there's some new elements here. And I think it's important also to recognize, and I think this has been a common theme also throughout all my comments in the chat box, that I do feel that it's important to remember that we're still living through this pandemic, and that it's coming in waves. The way we're dealing with everything, and the way governments are dealing with everything, it's obviously fluctuating. And so the main thing is that on both of these, I think what I want to just premise what I'm saying on the fourth industrial revolution and just energy transition is a lot of it, it is based on research, but a lot of it is also projection, because these things have been onset or expedited by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how the world's going to look. But what we do know is that these two things will have a fundamental impact on the extractives industry in particular, which I will go into in a moment. And so, yeah, I think it's just important, to bear that in mind, and that, we may have the just energy transition, which focuses on greener or sustainable energy systems, which are less carbon intense and not as reliant on fossil fuels, will look fundamentally different from the status quo. And so that will fundamentally change the extractives industry, and what kinds of metals are necessary. Things like cobalt and copper and nickel and lithium will become increasingly important. And we know that there are many resources on the African continent, not necessarily in, some countries have all of it, some countries have less of it, but I really think that there's a lot of opportunity for regional cooperation in that regard, and to try and harness the strengths of and to kind of be looking out for each other more. So I really do welcome these kinds of engagements. So what I really just wanted to talk about, and I think the key question when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution, and just to be clear what we're talking about, the fourth industrial revolution is characterized by technological innovations and the growing utilization of new technologies. So we have artificial intelligence, blockchain technologies, robotics, and cloud computing, which have brought about digital transformation and globalization that has revolutionized the global economy, which includes the extractive industry. So we've seen modernizations in the extractive industry, which I'm sure a lot of you engineers in the audience will know a lot more about than I would as a lawyer. But what we do know as well is that this legacy, so as I said, COVID has expedited this fourth industrial revolution because we've all become incredibly dependent on technology. And so this legacy is likely to continue beyond COVID and become the new normal. And so what's also happened, so as I said, there's been modernization in the mining sector, including implementing technological developments in data, analytics, and connectivity. But coinciding with this fourth industrial revolution is also increased calls for a just energy transition, which in essence is a transition away from fossil fuel-based energy systems, economies, and technologies to low or green energy systems. And so what's been happening now is many states have been pushing for a green recovery from the COVID pandemic. But so in terms of the origins of the term just energy transition, it comes from the trade unions. It was more labor focused in the 1980s and 1990s, and it was a response of the trade unions in the US to increase environmental protection and investment in promotion of clean technology, which disproportionately affected minority and low-income workers and communities. So steps had to be taken to actually manage this transition so that workers were not lost. So it was really a worker-focused term. And this term has really expanded. The context and the meaning has gone way beyond what it was. And what it is today is it means a fair and equitable process of moving towards a post-carbon society, which process must seek fairness and equity with regards to major global justice concerns, such as ethnicity, gender, and within both developing and developed contexts. So we can see that there's a lot of elements to that definition, right? There's greening, but there's also inequality, rectifying that, and that really is what the just transition is, the just energy transition. It can't just be one element of sustainable development. It has to be an integration of, economics, of social, of environmental, all together. And so I think just to touch on two challenges that I think that the fourth industrial revolution poses in the context of the just energy transition. So just to say that, it might seem a little bit random, the two seem kind of separate, but I think there's actually a very nice link between the fourth industrial revolution and the just energy transition. And this reciprocal relationship actually comes from the previous industrial revolutions, where energy fueled all the previous industrial revolutions and was a critical component or input in new manufacturing processes and technological innovations that developed. But the energy industry has also, and this includes mining, has also benefited immensely from innovations in previous industrial revolutions, which has enhanced extraction technologies and distribution possibilities. So essentially what I'm saying is that in the past, the story of the industrial revolutions has actually been a story of fossil fuels. And what we're seeing now with the fourth industrial revolution is an opportunity to potentially move away from the story of fossil fuels and one that now is an opportunity to kind of link a new industrial revolution with a less fossil fuel intense based revolution. And I think that, I guess the logical, one of the most logical challenges that arises is specifically, we know that with the fourth industrial revolution is going to be an increase in, technology and reliance on AI and in manufacturing processes. And so this will enhance mechanization in extraction and manufacturing processes. And this will pose a challenge for many unskilled or lower skilled jobs, which is a huge issue and really goes to the core of what a just energy transition, the concept used to mean, and making sure that that is exactly at the fore of how we approach this now. But I think just quickly, my proposed solution to that challenge is that, we can't, in some ways, I think we can't hold back on a fourth industrial revolution. We need to embrace it. But what we can do is, and we know that Africa is well endowed with natural resources, and unfortunately, it's been the subject of a resource curse. And what we can do is create a mutually beneficial beneficiation sector, which has been lacking. Most of our resources are extracted and taken to other parts of the world. And I think if we build a mutually beneficial beneficiation sector that reinforces an extractives industry, we can really enhance and use technology, but then also create so many more jobs. And so I think that's one way of kind of making a nice sync between the fourth industrial revolution and the just energy transition. And the last thing I just wanted to touch on is these supposed different paces of the fourth industrial revolution, which it's traditionally known as, thought of right now as quite a quick process, right? There's all these changes and innovations in technology that are happening fast, and that transition is happening quickly. Whereas a lot of people see a just energy transition as more of a slower process. My colleague spoke earlier about bridging gases being a bridging fuel within the just energy transition, and that is an example of how we realize that there's paces and phases. And so, again, that's where things can potentially you can see the fourth industrial revolution butting heads with this concept of a just energy transition. However, I think that what's really important to keep in mind is, there are arguments around the fact that on the continent, there's kind of limited technological infrastructure to actually embrace a fourth industrial revolution. And some argue that this can actually create a real opportunity on the African continent to leapfrog ahead. The leapfrogging argument is that Africa doesn't need to make the same mistakes that developed countries have made in the past, where they go through these high carbon intensive energy structures and also centralized grids, whereas we can actually have decentralized electricity that is not necessarily so carbon intensive. So that's what some people argue, but then they also say that I guess the counter argument to that is that there's an element of injustice there, and obviously with the just energy transition we're dealing with justice is at the core, right? And so there's this element of injustice there because there's this idea that energy is progressive in nature, and that you're actually disallowing African nations to also kind of go through that process of energy. But I think the important thing really to keep in mind is that there have been so many recent developments, as we know with COP26, there's been so many recent developments in sustainable finance and ESG, environmental social governance considerations. And whether we like it or not, internationally, these things are directing investment away from fossil fuels. And there are now increased opportunities for financing of sustainable energy systems. So all I'm saying is that it may become uneconomic to continue investing in the coal value chain, which kind of makes us think whether we need to have an accelerated just transition. I know that that might seem like an inequitable process, but there is opportunity there to kind of leapfrog and to really kind of grasp that investment in the sustainable finance space and have an accelerated energy transition, which can potentially now also utilize the fourth industrial revolution technology. And then again, that's more of a synchronization of this fast pace. So the paces are actually more aligned than not. So yeah, those are just some of the issues that I've dealt with. There are a lot of issues in this area that I think should be explored, should be written about, and lots of questions, really important questions for the extractives industry. And in going forward, I think that it would be great if we can focus a lot more research on it. Yeah, thanks for that. Aysha, you're on mute.
I mean, it's necessary, right? At least one person has to speak to themselves. So I'd like to thank everyone for being a part of this panel. I've posited one question, but you can see the depth of knowledge because you can just carry into this question and unpack various aspects of it. And I really do appreciate everyone that's been able to participate thus far. And I suppose there's just a spider diagram coming out of this forum, and we'll have a lot more questions to answer and research to unpack. So I'm going to hand over to Hanri for the final words, but from me, thank you so much for the MTM forum, and for Siam, we really appreciate you all for being here.
Thank you, Aysha. I have been deeply impressed with the range of thoughts and suggestions and analyses that have come to us through this panel, and I'm really very appreciative that our colleagues in engineering has given us the space to have this conversation, and I hope it's not the last conversation. I'm also very pleased that we, as critical as we might be, that we are also visionary in some respects, and Dalit, your final contribution has really opened my eyes to that, is to look to the future and use the opportunities that are created by this disruption is going to be our biggest opportunity and our biggest challenge. And we are, in 2 weeks' time, we're having another panel talking about the just transition in the context of a community of practice project that we have involving using fibrous plants to clean mine wasteland and building a diverse economic value stream through that. And I would like to encourage anybody who might be interested to contact us for an invitation. And I think it's actually a quite nice follow-up conversation from where we have left this off. I would like to thank my colleagues in the room, and I would like to thank all of our Melia students, researchers, and alumni. It was such a pleasure to hear from you, and to know that you are involved and to remain involved in our activities. Thank you very much for the platform and for your time.